The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, Chapter 6. The Reverend Casy and young Tom stood on the hill and looked down on the Joad place. The small, unpainted house was mashed at one corner, and it had been pushed off its foundation so that it slumped at an angle, its blind front windows pointing at a spot of sky well above the horizon. The fences were gone, and the cotton grew in the dooryard and up against the house, and the cotton was about the shed barn. The outhouse lay on its side, and the cotton grew close against it. Where the dooryard had been pounded hard by the bare feet of children and by stamping horses' hoofs, and by the broad wagon wheels, it was cultivated now, and the dark green, dusty cotton grew. Young Tom stared for a long time at the ragged willow beside the dry horse trough, at the concrete base where the pump had been. "Jesus," he said at last, "hell must have popped here. There ain't nobody living here." At last he moved quickly down the hill, and Casey followed him. He looked into the barn shed, deserted, a little ground straw on the floor, and at the mule stall in the corner. And as he looked in, there was a skittering on the floor, and a family of field mice faded in under the straw. Joad paused at the entrance to the tool shed lean-to, and no tools were there. A broken plow point, a mess of hay wire in the corner, an iron wheel from a hay rake, and a rat-gnawed mule collar. A flat-gallon oil can crusted with dirt and oil, and a pair of torn overalls hanging on a nail. "There ain't nothing left," said Joad. "We had pretty nice tools. There ain't nothing left." Casey said, "If I was still a preacher, I'd say the arm of the Lord had struck. But now I don't know what happened. I've been away. I didn't hear nothing." They walked toward the concrete well cap, walked through cotton plants to get to it, and the bolls were forming on the cotton, and the land was cultivated. "We never planted here," Joad said. "We always kept this clear. Why, you can't get a horse in now without he tromps the cotton." They paused at the dry watering trough, and the proper weeds that should grow under a trough were gone, and the old thick wood of the trough was dry and cracked. On the well cap the bolts that had held the pump stuck up, their threads rusty and the nuts gone. Joad looked into the tube of the well and spat and listened. He dropped a clod down the well and listened. "She was a good well," he said. "I can't hear water." He seemed reluctant to go to the house. He dropped clod after clod down the well. "Maybe they're all dead," he said, "but somebody'd have told me. I'd have got word some way. Maybe they left a letter or something to tell in the house. Would they have knowed you was coming out?" "I don't know," said Joad. "No, I guess not. I didn't know myself till a week ago." "Let's look in the house. She's all pushed out of shape. Something knocked the hell out of her." They walked slowly toward the sagging house. Two of the supports of the porch roof were pushed out so that the roof flopped down on one end, and the house corner was crushed in. Through a maze of splintered wood, the room at the corner was visible. The front door hung open inward, and a low, strong gate across the front door hung outward on leather hinges. Joad stopped at the step, a 12-by-12 timber. "Doorsteps here," he said, "but they're gone, or Ma's dead." He pointed to the low gate across the front door. "If Ma was anywheres about, that gate'd be shut and hooked. That's one thing she always done, seen that gate was shut." His eyes were warm. "Ever since the pig got in over to Jacob's and ate the baby. Millie Jacobs was just out in the barn. She come in while the pig was still eating it. Well, Millie Jacobs was in a family way, and she went raving. Never did get over it. Touched ever since. But Ma took a lesson from it. She never left that pig gate open, lest she was in the house herself. Never did forget. No, they're gone, or dead." He climbed to the split porch and looked into the kitchen. The windows were broken out, and throwing rocks lay on the floor, and the floor and walls sagged steeply away from the door, and the sifted dust was on the boards. Joad pointed to the broken glass and the rocks. "Kids," he said, "they'll go 20 miles to bust a window. I done it myself. They know when a house is empty, they know. That's the first thing kids do when folks move out." The kitchen was empty of furniture, stove gone, and the round stovepipe hole in the wall showing light. On the sink shelf lay an old beer opener and a broken fork with its wooden handle gone. Joad slipped cautiously into the room, and the floor groaned under his weight. An old copy of the Philadelphia Ledger was on the floor against the wall, its pages yellow and curling. Joad looked into the bedroom. No bed, no chairs, nothing. On the wall, a picture of an Indian girl in color, labeled Red Wing. A bed slat leaning against the wall, and in one corner a woman's high-button shoe, curled up at the toe and broken over the instep. Joad picked it up and looked at it. "I remember this," he said. "This was Ma's. It's all wore out now. Ma liked them shoes. Had 'em for years. No, they've went and took everything." The sun had lowered until it came through the angled end windows now, and it flashed on the edges of the broken glass. Joe turned at last and went out and crossed the porch. He sat down on the edge of it and rested his bare feet on the 12-by-12 step. The evening light was on the fields, and the cotton plants threw long shadows on the ground, and the molting willow tree threw a long shadow. Casey sat down beside Jode. "They never wrote you nothing?" he asked. "No, like I said, they wasn't people to write. Pa could write, but he wouldn't. Didn't like to. It'd give him the shivers to write. He could work out a catalog order as good as the next fella, but he wouldn't write no letter just for ducks." They sat side by side, staring off into the distance. Jode laid his rolled coat on the porch beside him. His independent hands rolled a cigarette, smoothed it, and lighted it, and he inhaled deeply and blew the smoke out through his nose. "Something's wrong," he said. "I can't put my finger on her. I got an itch that something's wronger'n hell. Just this house pushed around and my folks gone." Casey said, "Right over there the ditch was, where I done the baptizing. You wasn't mean, but you was tough. Hung on to that little girl's pigtail like a bulldog. We baptized you both in the name of the Holy Ghost, and still you hung on. Old Tom says, 'Hold 'em under water.' So I shove your head down till you start to bubblin' before you let go of that pigtail. You wasn't mean, but you was tough. Sometimes a tough kid grows up with a big jolt of the spirit in him." A lean gray cat came sneaking out of the barn and crept through the cotton plants to the end of the porch. It leaped silently up to the porch and crept low-belly toward the men. It came to a place between and behind the two, and then it sat down, and its tail stretched out straight and flat to the floor, and the last inch of it flicked. The cat sat and looked off into the distance where the men were looking. Jode glanced around at it. "By God, look who's here." Somebody stayed. He put out his hand, but the cat leaped away out of reach and sat down and licked the pads of its lifted paw. Jode looked at it, and his face was puzzled. "I know what's the matter," he cried. "That cat just made me figure what's wrong." "Seems to me there's lots wrong," said Casey. "No, it's more'n just this place. Why didn't that cat just move in with some neighbors, with the Rances? How come nobody ripped some lumber off this house? Ain't been nobody here for 3-4 months, and nobody's stole no lumber. Nice planks on the barn shed, plenty good planks on the house, window frames, and nobody's took 'em. That ain't right. That's what was bothering me, and I couldn't catch hold of her." "Well, what's that figure out for you?" Casey reached down and slipped off his sneakers and wriggled his long toes on the step. "I don't know. Seems like maybe there ain't any neighbors. If there was, would all them nice planks be here? Why, Jesus Christ, Albert Rance took his family, kids and dogs and all, into Oklahoma City one Christmas. They was going to visit with Albert's cousin. Well, folks around here thought Albert moved away without saying nothing. Figured maybe he got debts or some woman squaring off at him. When Albert come back a week later, there wasn't a thing left in his house. Stove was gone, beds was gone, window frames was gone, and 8 feet of planking was gone off the south side of the house, so you could look right through her. He come driving home just as Muley Graves was going away with 3 doors and the well pump. Took Albert 2 weeks driving around the neighbors before he got his stuff back." Casey scratched his toes luxuriously. "Didn't nobody give him an argument? All of 'em just give the stuff up?" "Sure, they wasn't stealing it. They thought he left it, and they just took it. He got all of it back, all but a sofa pillow, velvet with a picture of an Injun on it. Albert claimed Grandpa got it. Claimed Grandpa got Injun blood. That's why he wants that picture. Well, Grandpa did get her, but he didn't give a damn about the picture on it. He just liked her. Used to pack her around, and he'd put her wherever he was going to sit. He never would give her back to Albert. Says if Albert wants his pillow so bad, let him come and get her. But he better come shooting, 'cause I'll blow his goddamn stinking head off if he comes messing around my pillow." So finally, Albert give up and made Grandpa a present of that pillow. It give Grandpa ideas, though. He took to saving chicken feathers, says he's going to have a whole damn bed of feathers, but he never got no feather bed. One time Pa got mad at a skunk under the house. Pa slapped that skunk with a 2x4, and Ma burned all Grandpa's feathers so we could live in the house. He laughed. Grandpa's a tough old bastard, just sat on that Injun pillow and says, "Let Albert come and get her." Why, he says, "I'll take that squirt and wring him out like a pair of drawers." The cat crept close between the men again, and its tail lay flat and its whiskers jerked now and then. The sun dropped low toward the horizon, and the dusty air was red and golden. The cat reached out a gray, questioning paw and touched Jode's coat. He looked around. "Hell, I forgot the turtle. I ain't gonna pack it all over hell." He unwrapped the land turtle and pushed it under the house. But in a moment it was out, headed southwest as it had been from the first. The cat leaped at it and struck at its straining head and slashed at its moving feet. The old, hard, humorous head was pulled in, and the thick tail slapped in under the shell, and when the cat grew tired of waiting for it and walked off, the turtle headed on southwest again. Young Tom Joad and the preacher watched the turtle go, waving its legs and boosting its heavy, high-domed shell along toward the southwest. The cat crept along behind for a while, but in a dozen yards it arched its back to a strong, taut bow and yawned, and came stealthily back toward the seated men. "Where the hell you suppose he's going?" said Joad. "I seen turtles all my life. They're always going someplace. They always seem to want to get there." The gray cat seated itself between and behind them again. It blinked slowly. The skin over its shoulders jerked forward under a flea, and then slipped slowly back. The cat lifted a paw and inspected it, flicked its claws out and in again experimentally, and licked its pad with a shell-pink tongue. The red sun touched the horizon and spread out like a jellyfish, and the sky above it seemed much brighter and more alive than it had been. Joad unrolled his new yellow shoes from his coat, and he brushed his dusty feet with his hand before he slipped them on. The preacher, staring off across the field, said, "Somebody's coming. Look, down there, right through the cotton." Joad looked where Casey's finger pointed. "Coming afoot," he said. "Can't see him for the dust he raises. Who the hell's coming here?" They watched the figure approaching in the evening light, and the dust it raised was reddened by the setting sun. "Man," said Joad. The man drew closer, and as he walked past the barn, Joad said, "Why, I know him. You know him. That's Muley Graves." And he called, "Hey, Muley, how ya?" The approaching man stopped, startled by the call, and then he came on quickly. He was a lean man, rather short. His movements were jerky and quick. He carried a gunny sack in his hand. His blue jeans were pale at knee and seat, and he wore an old black suit coat, stained and spotted, the sleeves torn loose from the shoulders and back, and ragged holes worn through at the elbows. His black hat was as stained as his coat, and the band, torn half free, flopped up and down as he walked. Muley's face was smooth and unwrinkled, but it wore the truculent look of a bad child, the mouth held tight and small, the little eyes half scowling, half petulant. "You remember Muley," Joad said softly to the preacher. "Who's that?" the advancing man called. Joad did not answer. Muley came close, very close, before he made out the faces. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "It's Tommy Joad. When'd you get out, Tommy?" He dropped his sack to the ground. 2 days ago," said Joad. "Took a little time to hitchhike home. And look here what I find. Where's my folks, Muley? What's the house all smashed up for, and cotton planted in the dooryard?" "By God, it's lucky I come by," said Muley, "'cause old Tom worried himself. When they was fixin' to move, I was settin' in the kitchen there. I just told Tom I wasn't going to move, by God. I told him that, and Tom says, 'I'm worrying myself about Tommy. S'pose he comes home and they ain't nobody here. What'll he think?' I says, 'Why don't you write down a letter?' And Tom says, 'Maybe I will. I'll think about her. But if I don't, you keep your eye out for Tommy if you're still around.' 'I'll be around,' I says. 'I'll be around till hell freezes over. There ain't nobody can run a guy named Graves out of this country. And they ain't done it neither.'" Joad said impatiently, "Where's my folks? Tell about you standing up to 'em later, but where's my folks?" "Well, they was going to stick her out when the bank come to tractoring off the place. Your grandpa stood out here with a rifle, and he blowed the headlights off that cat, but she come on just the same. Your grandpa didn't want to kill the guy driving that cat, and that was Willie Feely, and Willie knowed it, so he just come on and bumped the hell out of the house. Old Tom just stood there a-cussin', but it didn't do him no good. When he sees that cat come a-bustin' through the house and give her a shake like a dog shakes a rat, well, it took something out of Tom. Kinda got into him. He ain't been the same ever since. Where is my folks?" Joad spoke angrily. "What I'm telling you. Took 3 trips with your Uncle John's wagon. Took the stove and the pump and the beds. You should have seen them beds go out with all them kids and your grandma and grandpa setting up against the headboard, and your brother Noah setting there smoking a cigarette and spitting la-di-da over the side of the wagon." Joad opened his mouth to speak. "They're all at your Uncle John's," Muley said quickly. "Oh, all at John's. Well, what they doing there? Now stick to her for a second, Muley. Just stick to her. In just a minute you can go on your own way. What they doing there? Well, they've been chopping cotton, all of them. Even the kids and your grandpa. Getting money together so they can shove on west. Gonna buy a car and shove on west where it's easy living. There ain't nothing here. 50 cents a clean acre for chopping cotton, and folks begging for the chance to chop." "And they ain't gone yet?" "No," said Muley, "not that I know.
Last I heard was 4 days ago when I seen your brother Noah out shooting jackrabbits, and he says they're aiming to go in about 2 weeks. John got his notice he got to get off. You just go on about 8 miles to John's place. You'll find your folks piled in John's house like gophers in a winter burrow. Okay, said Jode. Now you can ride on your own way. You ain't changed a bit, Muley. If you want to tell about something off northwest, you point your nose straight southeast. Muley said truculently, You ain't changed neither. You was a smart aleck kid, and you're still a smart aleck. You ain't telling me how to skin my life, by any chance. Jode grinned. No, I ain't. If you want to drive your head into a pile of broken glass, there ain't nobody can tell you different. You know this here preacher, don't you, Muley? Reverend Casy. Why, sure. Didn't look over. Remember him well. Casey stood up, and the two shook hands. Glad to see you again, said Muley. You ain't been around for a hell of a long time. I've been off asking questions, said Casey. What happened here? Why they kicking folks off the land? Muley's mouth snapped shut so tightly that a little parrot's beak in the middle of his upper lip stuck down over his underlip. He scowled. Them sons of bitches, he said. Them dirty sons of bitches, I tell you, men. I'm staying. They ain't getting rid of me. If they throw me off, I'll come back, and if they figure I'll be quiet underground, why, I'll take a 3 of the sons of bitches along for company. He patted a heavy weight in his side coat pocket. I ain't a-goin'. My pa come here 50 years ago, and I ain't a-goin'. Jode said, What's the idea of kicking the folks off? Oh, they talked pretty about it. You know what kind of years we've been having. Dust coming up and spoiling everything, so a man didn't get enough crop to plug up an ant's ass. And everybody got bills at the grocery. You know how it is. Well, the folks that owns the land says we can't afford to keep no tenants. And they says the share a tenant gets is just the margin of profit we can't afford to lose. And they says if we put all our land in one piece, we can just hardly make her pay. So they tractored all the tenants off of the land, all except me, and by God, I ain't going. Tommy, you knowed me all your life. Damn right, said Jode, all my life. Well, you know I ain't a fool. I know this land ain't much good, never was much good, except for grazing. Never should have broke her up, and now she's cotton damn near to death. If only they didn't tell me I got to get off, why, I'd probably be in California right now, eating grapes and picking oranges when I wanted. But them sons of bitches says I got to get off, and Jesus Christ, a man can't when he's told to. Sure, said Jode. I wonder Pa went so easy. I wonder Grandpa didn't kill nobody. Nobody never told Grandpa where to put his feet. And Ma ain't nobody you can push around either. I seen her beat the hell out of a tin peddler with a live chicken one time 'cause he give her an argument. She had the chicken in one hand, the axe in the other, about to cut its head off. She aimed to go for that peddler with the axe, but she forgot which hand was which, and she takes after him with the chicken. Couldn't even eat that chicken when she got done. There wasn't nothing but a pair of legs in her hand. Grandpa throwed his hip out of joint laughing. How'd my folks go so easy? Well, the guy that come around talked nice as pie. You got to get off. It ain't my fault. Well, I said, whose fault is it? I'll go and I'll nut the fella. It's the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company. I just got orders. Who's the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company? It ain't nobody. It's a company. Got a fella crazy. There wasn't nobody you could lay for. A lot of the folks just tired out looking for something to be mad at, but not me. I'm mad at all of it. I'm staying. A large red drop of sun lingered on the horizon and then dripped over and was gone, and the sky was brilliant over the spot where it had gone, and a torn cloud like a bloody rag hung over the spot of its going. And dusk crept over the sky from the eastern horizon, and darkness crept over the land from the east. The evening star flashed and glittered in the dusk. The gray cat sneaked away toward the open barn shed and passed inside like a shadow. Jode said, Well, we ain't going to walk no 8 miles to Uncle John's place tonight. My dogs is burned up. How's it if we go to your place, Muley? That's only about a mile. Won't do no good, Muley seemed embarrassed. My wife and the kids and her brother all took and went to California. There wasn't nothing to eat. They wasn't as mad as me, so they went. There wasn't nothing to eat here. The preacher stirred nervously. You should have went, too. You shouldn't have broke up the family. I couldn't, said Muley grave. Something just wouldn't let me. Well, by God, I'm hungry, said Jode. 4 solemn years I've been eating right on the minute. My guts is yelling bloody murder. What you gonna eat, Muley? How you been getting your dinner? Muley said ashamedly, For a while I ate frogs and squirrels and prairie dogs sometimes. Had to do it. But now I got some wire nooses on the tracks in the dry stream brush. Get rabbits and sometimes a prairie chicken. Skunks get caught and coons too. He reached down, picked up his sack, and emptied it on the porch. 2 cottontails and a jackrabbit fell out and rolled over limply, soft and furry. God almighty, said Joe, it's more'n 4 years since I've had fresh-killed meat. Casey picked up one of the cottontails and held it in his hand. You sharing with us, Muley Graves? He asked. Muley fidgeted in embarrassment. I ain't got no choice in the matter. He stopped on the ungracious sound of his own words. That ain't like I mean it. That ain't, he stumbled. What I mean, if a fella's got something to eat and another fella's hungry, why, the first fella ain't got no choice. Suppose I pick up my rabbits and go off somewheres and eat 'em, see? I see, said Casey. I can see that. Muley sees something there, Tom. Muley's got a hold of something, and it's too big for him, and it's too big for me. Young Tom rubbed his hands together. Who got a knife? Let's get at these here miserable rodents. Let's get at them. Muley reached in his pants pocket and produced a large horn-handled pocket knife. Tom Joad took it from him, opened a blade, and smelled it. He drove the blade again and again into the ground and smelled it again, wiped it on his trouser leg, and felt the edge with his thumb. Muley took a quart bottle of water out of his hip pocket and set it on the porch. Go easy on that there water, he said. That's all there is. This here well's filled in. Tom took up a rabbit in his hand. One of you go get some bale wire out of the barn. We'll make a fire with some of this broken plank from the house. He looked at the dead rabbit. There ain't nothing so easy to get ready as a rabbit, he said. He lifted the skin of the back, slit it, put his fingers in the hole, and tore the skin off. It slipped off like a stocking, slipped off the body to the neck and off the legs to the paws. Joad picked up the knife again and cut off head and feet. He laid the skin down, slit the rabbit along the ribs, shook out the intestines onto the skin, and then threw the mess off into the cotton field. And the clean, muscled little body was ready. Joad cut off the legs and cut the meaty back into 2 pieces. He was picking up the second rabbit when Casey came back with a snarl of bale wire in his hand. Now build up the fire and put some steaks up, said Joad. Jesus Christ, I'm hungry for these here creatures. He cleaned and cut up the rest of the rabbits and strung them on the wire. Muley and Casey tore splintered boards from the wrecked house corner and started a fire, and they drove a stake into the ground on each side to hold the wire. Muley came back to Joad. Look out for boils on that jackrabbit, he said. I don't like to eat no jackrabbit with boils. He took a little cloth bag from his pocket and put it on the porch. Joad said, The jack was clean as a whistle. Jesus God, you got salt too? By any chance you got some plates and a tent in your pocket? He poured salt in his hand and sprinkled it over the pieces of rabbit strung on the wire. The fire leaped and threw shadows on the house, and the dry wood crackled and snapped. The sky was almost dark now, and the stars were out sharply. The gray cat came out of the barn shed and trotted meowing toward the fire, but nearly there it turned and went directly to one of the little piles of rabbit entrails on the ground. It chewed and swallowed, and the entrails hung from its mouth. Casey sat on the ground beside the fire, feeding it broken pieces of board, pushing the long boards in as the flame ate off their ends. The evening bats flashed into the firelight and out again. The cat crouched back and licked its lips, then washed its face and whiskers. Joad held up his rabbit-laden wire between his 2 hands and walked to the fire. Here, take one end, Muley. Wrap your end around that stake. That's good now. Let's tighten her up. We ought to wait till the fire's burned down, but I can't wait. He made the wire taut, then found a stick and slipped the pieces of meat along the wire until they were over the fire, and the flames licked up around the meat and hardened and glazed the surfaces. Joad sat down by the fire, but with his stick he moved and turned the rabbit so that it would not become sealed to the wire. This here is a party, he said. Yes, sir, this sure as hell is a party. Salt Muley's got, and water and rabbits. I wish he got a pot of hominy in his pocket. That's all I wish. Muley said over the fire, You fellas 'd think I'm touched the way I live. Touched nothing, said Joad. If you're touched, I wished everybody was touched. Muley continued, Well, sir, it's a funny thing. Something wouldn't happen to me when they told me I had to get off the place. First I was going to go in and kill a whole flock of people, then all my folks all went away out west, and I got wandering around just walking around. Never went far, slept wherever I was. I was going to sleep here tonight. That's why I come. I'd tell myself I'm looking after things so when all the folks come back it'll be all right. But I knowed that wasn't true. There ain't nothing to look after. The folks ain't never coming back. I'm just wandering around like a damn old graveyard ghost. Fella gets used to a place, it's hard to go, said Casey. Fella gets used to a way of thinking, it's hard to leave. I ain't a preacher no more, but all the time I find I'm praying, not even thinking what I'm doing. Joad turned the pieces of meat over on the wire. The juice was dripping now, and every drop as it fell in the fire shot up a spurt of flame. The smooth surface of the meat was crinkling up and turning a faint brown. Smell her, said Joad. Jesus, look down and just smell her. Muley went on, like a damn old graveyard ghost. I've been going around the places where stuff happened. Like there's a place over by our 40, in a gully there's a bush. First time I ever laid with a girl was there. Me 14 and stamping and jerking and snorting like a buck deer, Randy as a billy goat. So I went there and I laid down on the ground. And I've seen it all happen again. And there's the place down by the barn where Pa got gored to death by a bull. And his blood is right in that ground, right now. Must be. Nobody ever washed it out. And I put my hand on that ground where my own Pa's blood is part of it. He paused uneasily. You fellows think I'm touched? Joe turned the meat and his eyes were inward. Casey, feet drawn up, stared into the fire. 15 feet back from the men, the fed cat was sitting, the long gray tail wrapped neatly around the front feet. A big owl shrieked as it went overhead, and the firelight showed its white underside and the spread of its wings. No, said Casey, you're lonely, but you ain't touched. Muley's tight little face was rigid. I put my hand right on the ground where that blood is still, and I seen my Pa with a hole through his chest, and I felt him shiver up against me like he done, and I seen him kind of settle back and reach with his hands and his feet. And I seen his eyes all milky with hurt, and then he was still, and his eyes so clear, looking up. And me, a little kid, settin' there, not crying nor nothing, just settin' there. He shook his head sharply. Joe turned the meat over and over, and I went in the room where Joe was born. Bed wasn't there, but it was the room. And all them things is true, and they're right in the place they happened. Joe come to life right there. He give a big old gasp, and then he let out a squawk you could hear a mile. And his grandma standing there says, that's a daisy, over and over. And her so proud she bust 3 cups that night. Joe cleared his throat. Think we better eat her now. Let her get good and done, good and brown, almost black, said Muley irritably. I want to talk. I ain't talked to nobody. If I'm touched, and that's the end of it. Like a old graveyard ghost going to neighbors' houses in the night. Peters, Jacobs, Rances, Jodes, and the houses all dark. Standing like miserable ratty boxes, but they was good parties and dancing. And there was meetin's and shoutin' glory. There was weddin's all in them houses, and then I'd want to go in town and kill folks. 'Cause what'd they take when they tractored the folks off the land? What'd they get so their margin of profit was safe? They got Pa dying on the ground, and Joe yelling his first breath, and me jerking like a billy goat under a bush in the night. What'd they get? God knows the land ain't no good. Nobody been able to make a crop for years, but them sons of bitches at their desks, they just chop folks in two for their margin of profit. They just cut 'em in two. Place where folks live is them folks. They ain't whole, out lonely on the road in a piled-up car. They ain't alive no more. Them sons of bitches killed him, and he was silent, his thin lips still moving, his chest still panting. He sat and looked down at his hands in the firelight. I ain't talked to nobody for a long time, he apologized softly. I've been sneaking around like a old graveyard ghost. Casey pushed the long boards into the fire, and the flames licked up around them and leaped up toward the meat again. The house cracked loudly as the cooler night air contracted the wood. Casey said quietly, I gotta see them folks that's gone out on the road. I got a feeling I got to see 'em. They gonna need help no preacher can give 'em. Hope of heaven when their lives ain't lived. Holy Spirit when their own spirit is downcast and sad. They gonna need help. They got to live before they can afford to die. Jode cried nervously, Jesus Christ, let's eat this meat, for it's smaller'n a cooked mouse. Look at her, smell her. He leaped to his feet and slid the pieces of meat along the wire until they were clear of the fire. He took Muley's knife from his pocket and sawed through a piece of meat until it was free of the wire. Here's for the preacher, he said. I told you I ain't no preacher. Well, here's for the man, then. He cut off another piece. Here, Muley, if you ain't too goddamn upset to eat. This here's jackrabbit, tougher'n a bull bitch. He sat back and clamped his long teeth on the meat and tore out a great bite and chewed it. Jesus Christ, hear her crunch. And he tore out another bite ravenously. Muley still sat, regarding his meat. Maybe I oughtn't to talked like that, he said. Fella should maybe keep stuff like that in his head. Casey looked over, his mouth full of rabbit. He chewed and his muscled throat convulsed in swallowing. Yes, you should talk, he said. Sometimes a sad man can talk the sadness right out through his mouth. Sometimes a killin' man can talk the murder right out of his mouth and not do no murder. You done right. Don't you kill nobody if you can help it. And he bit out another hunk of rabbit. Joe tossed the bones in the fire and jumped up and cut more off the wire. Muley was eating slowly now, and his nervous little eyes went from one to the other of his companions. Joe ate scowling like an animal, and a ring of grease formed around his mouth. For a long time Muley looked at him, almost timidly. He put down the hand that held the meat. "Tommy," he said. Joe looked up and did not stop gnawing the meat. "Yeah," he said, around a mouthful. "Tommy, you ain't mad with me talking about killing people. You ain't huffy, Tom." "No," said Tom, "I ain't huffy. It's just something that happened." "Everybody knowed it wasn't no fault of yours," said Muley. "Old man Turnbull said he was going to get you when you come out. Says nobody can kill one of his boys. All the folks hereabouts talked him out of it, though." "We was drunk," Joe said softly, "drunk at a dance. I don't know how she started. And then I felt that knife go in me, and that sobered me up. First thing I see is Herb coming for me again with his knife. There was this here shovel leaning against the schoolhouse, so I grabbed it and smacked him over the head. I never had nothing against Herb. He was a nice fella, come a bullin' after my sister Rosasharn when he was a little fella. No, I liked Herb." Well, everybody told his pa that, and finally cooled him down. "Somebody says they's Hatfield's blood on his mother's side in old Turnbull, and he's got to live up to it. I don't know about that. Him and his folks went on to California 6 months ago." Joe took the last of the rabbit from the wire and passed it around. He settled back and ate more slowly now, chewed evenly, and wiped the grease from his mouth with his sleeve. And his eyes, dark and half-closed, brooded as he looked into the dying fire. "Everybody's going west," he said. "I got me a parole to keep. Can't leave the state." "Parole?" Muley asked. "I heard about them. How do they work?" "Well, I got out early, 3 years early. There's stuff I gotta do, or they send me back in. Got to report every so often." "How they treat you there in McAllister? My woman's cousin was in McAllister, and they give him hell." "It ain't so bad," said Joe, "like every place else. They give you hell if you raise hell. You get along okay unless some guard gets it in for you. Then you catch plenty hell. I got along okay. Minded my own business like any guy would. I learned to write nice as hell. Birds and stuff like that, too. Not just word writing. My old man'll be sore when he sees me whip out a bird in one stroke. Pa's gonna be mad when he sees me do that. He don't like no fancy stuff like that. He don't even like word writing. Kinda scares him, I guess. Every time Pa seen writing, somebody took something away from him." "They didn't give you no beatings or nothing like that?" "No, I just tended my own affairs. Course you get goddamn good and sick of doing the same thing day after day for 4 years. If you done something you was ashamed of, you might think about that. But hell, if I seen Herb Turnbull coming for me with a knife right now, I'd squash him down with a shovel again." "Anybody would," said Muley. The preacher stared into the fire, and his high forehead was white in the settling dark. The flash of little flames picked out the cords of his neck. His hands, clasped about his knees, were busy pulling knuckles. Joe threw the last bones into the fire and licked his fingers and then wiped them on his pants. He stood up and brought the bottle of water from the porch, took a sparing drink, and passed the bottle before he sat down again. He went on. "The thing that give me the most trouble was it didn't make no sense. You don't look for no sense when lightning kills a cow or it comes up a flood. That's just the way things is. But when a bunch of men take and lock you up 4 years, it ought to have some meaning. Men is supposed to think things out. Here they put me in and keep me and feed me 4 years. That ought to either make me so I won't do her again, or else punish me so I'll be afraid to do her again." He paused. "But if Herb or anybody else come for me, I'd do her again. Do her before I could figure her out. Especially if I was drunk. That sort of senselessness kinda worries a man." Muley observed, "Judge says he give you a light sentence 'cause it wasn't all your fault." Joe said, "There's a guy in McAllister, lifer. He studies all the time. He's secretary of the warden, writes the warden's letters and stuff like that. Well, he's one hell of a bright guy and reads law and all stuff like that. Well, I talked to him one time about her, 'cause he reads so much stuff, and he says it don't do no good to read books. Says he's read everything about prisons now and in the old times. And he says she makes less sense to him now than she did before he starts reading. He says it's a thing that started way to hell and gone back, and nobody seems to be able to stop her, and nobody got sense enough to change her. He says for God's sake don't read about her, because he says for one thing you'll just get messed up worse, and for another you won't have no respect for the guys that work the governments." "I ain't got a hell of a lot of respect for 'em now," says Muley. "Only kind of government we got that leans on us fellas is a safe margin of profit. There's one thing that got me stumped, and that's Willie Feely, driving that cat and gonna be a straw boss on land his own folks used to farm. That worries me. I can see how a fella might come from some other place and not know no better, but Willie belongs. Worried me, so I went up to him and asked him. Right off, he got mad. I got 2 little kids, he says. I got a wife and my wife's mother. Them people got to eat. Gets madder'n hell. First and only thing I got to think about is my own folks, he says. What happens to other folks is their lookout, he says. Seems like he's ashamed, so he gets mad. Jim Casey had been staring at the dying fire, and his eyes had grown wider and his neck muscles stood higher. Suddenly he cried, I got her. If ever a man got a dose of the spirit, I got her. Got her all of a flash. He jumped to his feet and paced back and forth, his head swinging. Had a tent one time, drawed as much as 500 people every night. That's before either you fellas seen me. He stopped and faced them. Ever notice I never took no collections when I was preaching out here to folks, in barns and in the open? By God, you never, said Muley. People around here got so used to not giving you money they got to being a little mad when some other preacher come along and passed the hat. Yes, sir. I took something to eat, said Casey. I took a pair of pants when mine was wore out and an old pair of shoes when I was walking through to the ground, but it wasn't like when I had the tent. Some days there I'd take in $10 or $20. Wasn't happy that-a-way, so I give her up, and for a time I was happy. I think I got her now. I don't know if I can say her. I guess I won't try to say her, but maybe there's a place for a preacher. Maybe I can preach again. Folks out lonely on the road, folks with no land, no home to go to. They got to have some kind of home. Maybe, he stood over the fire. The 100 muscles of his neck stood out in high relief, and the firelight went deep into his eyes and ignited red embers. He stood and looked at the fire, his face tense, as though he were listening, and the hands that had been active to pick, to handle, to throw ideas grew quiet, and in a moment crept into his pockets. The bats flittered in and out of the dull firelight, and the soft, watery burble of a nighthawk came from across the fields. Tom reached quietly into his pocket and brought out his tobacco, and he rolled a cigarette slowly and looked over it at the coals while he worked. He ignored the whole speech of the preacher as though it were some private thing that should not be inspected. He said, night after night in my bunk I figured how she'd be when I come home again. I figured maybe Grandpa or Grandma'd be dead, and maybe there'd be some new kids. Maybe Pa'd not be so tough. Maybe Ma'd sit back a little and let Rosa Shorn do the work. I knowed it wouldn't be the same as it was. Well, we'll sleep here, I guess, and come daylight we'll get on to Uncle John's. Leastwise, I will. You think you're coming along, Casey? The preacher still stood looking into the coals. He said slowly, yeah, I'm going with you, and where folks are on the road, I'm going to be with them. You'd be welcome, said Jode. Ma always favored you, said you was a preacher to trust. Rosa Sharn wasn't growed up then. He turned his head. Muley, you going to walk on over with us? Muley was looking toward the road over which they had come. Think you'll come along, Muley, Jode repeated. Huh? No, I don't go no place and I don't leave no place. See that glow over there jerking up and down? That's probably the superintendent of this stretch of cotton. Somebody may be seen our fire. Tom looked. The glow of light was nearing over the hill. We ain't doing no harm, he said. We'll just set here. We ain't doing nothing. Muley cackled. Yeah, we're doing something just being here. We are trespassing. We can't stay. They've been trying to catch me for 2 months. Now you look. If that's a car coming, we go out in the cotton and lay down. Don't have to go far. Then by God, let 'em try to find us. Have to look up and down every row. Just keep your head down. Joe demanded, what's come over you, Muley? You wasn't never no run and hide, fella. You was mean. Muley watched the approaching lights. Yeah, he said, I was mean like a wolf. Now I'm mean like a weasel. When you're hunting something, you're a hunter and you're strong. Can't nobody beat a hunter. But when you get hunted, that's different. Something happens to you. You ain't strong. Maybe you're fierce, but you ain't strong. I've been hunted now for a long time. I ain't a hunter no more. I'd maybe shoot a fella in the dark, but I don't maul nobody with a fence stake no more. It don't do no good to fool you or me. That's how it is. Well, you go out and hide, said Joe. Leave me and Casey tell these bastards a few things. The beam of light was closer now, and it bounced into the sky and then disappeared, and then bounced up again. All 3 men watched. Muley said, there's one more thing about being hunted. You get to thinking about all the dangerous things. If you're hunting, you don't think about 'em and you ain't scared. Like he says to me, if you get in any trouble, they'll send you back to McAllister to finish your time. That's right, said Joe. That's what they told me. But setting here resting or sleeping on the ground, that ain't getting in no trouble. That ain't doing nothing wrong. That ain't like getting drunk or raising hell. Muley laughed. You'll see. You just set here and the car'll come. Maybe it's Willie Feely, and Willie's a deputy sheriff now. What you doing trespassing here, Willie says. Well, you always did know Willie was full of crap, so you said, what's it to you? Willie gets mad and says, you get off or I'll take you in. And you ain't going to let no Feely push you around, 'cause he's mad and scared. He's made a bluff and he's got to go on with it, and here's you getting tough and you got to go through. Oh, hell, it's a lot easier to lay out in the cotton and let 'em look. It's more fun, too, 'cause they're mad and can't do nothing. And you're out there a-laughing at 'em. But you just talk to Willie or any boss, and you slug hell out of 'em, and they'll take you in and run you back to McAllister for 3 years. You're talking sense, said Jode. Every word you say is sense. But Jesus, I hate to get pushed around. I lots rather take a sock at Willie. He got a gun, said Muley. He'll use it 'cause he's a deputy. Then he either got to kill you or you got to get his gun away and kill him. Come on, Tommy. You can easy tell yourself you're fooling them lying out like that. And it all just amounts to what you tell yourself. The strong lights angled up into the sky now, and the even drone of a motor could be heard. Come on, Tommy, don't have to go far. Just 14-15 rows over, and we can watch what they do. Tom got to his feet. By God, you're right, he said. I ain't got a thing in the world to win, no matter how it comes out. Come on, then, over this way. Muley moved around the house and out into the cotton field about 50 yards. This is good, he said. Now lay down. You only got to pull your head down if they start the spotlight going. It's kind of fun. The 3 men stretched out at full length and propped themselves on their elbows. Muley sprang up and ran toward the house, and in a few moments he came back and threw a bundle of coats and shoes down. They'd have taken him along just to get even, he said. The lights topped the rise and bore down on the house. Jode asked, won't they come out here with flashlights and look around for us? I wished I had a stick. Muley giggled. No, they won't. I told you I'm mean like a weasel. Willie done that one night, and I clipped him from behind with a fence stake. Knocked him colder 'n a wedge. He told later how 5 guys come at him. The car drew up to the house, and a spotlight snapped on. Duck, said Muley. The bar of cold white light swung over their heads and crisscrossed the field. The hiding men could not see any movement, but they heard a car door slam, and they heard voices. Scared to get in the light, Muley whispered. Once, twice, I took a shot at the headlights. That keeps Willie careful. He got somebody with him tonight. They heard footsteps on wood, and then from inside the house they saw the glow of a flashlight. Shall I shoot through the house? Muley whispered. They couldn't see where it come from. Give 'em something to think about. Sure, go ahead, said Jode. Don't do it, Casey whispered. It won't do no good. Just a waste. We got to get thinking about doing stuff that means something. A scratching sound came from near the house. Putting out the fire, Muley whispered, kicking dust over it. The car door slammed, the headlights swung around and faced the road again. Now duck, said Muley. They dropped their heads and the spotlight swept over them, and crossed and recrossed the cotton field. And then the car started and slipped away and topped the rise and disappeared. Muley sat up. Willie always tries that last flash. He done it so often I can time him. And he still thinks it's cute. Casey said, maybe they left some fellas at the house. They'd catch us when we come back. Maybe. You fellas wait here. I know this game. He walked quietly away, and only a slight crunching of clods could be heard from his passage. The 2 waiting men tried to hear him, but he had gone. In a moment he called from the house. They didn't leave nobody. Come on back. Casey and Jode struggled up and walked back toward the black bulk of the house. Muley met them near the smoking dust pile which had been their fire. I didn't think they'd leave nobody, he said proudly. Me knocking Willie over and taking a shot at the lights once, twice, keeps 'em careful. They ain't sure who it is, and I ain't gonna let 'em catch me. I don't sleep near no house. If you fellas want to come along, I'll show you where to sleep, where there ain't nobody gonna stumble over you. Lead off, said Jode. We'll follow you. I never thought I'd be hiding out on my old man's place. Muley set off across the fields, and Jode and Casey followed him. They kicked the cotton plants as they went. You'll be hiding from lots of stuff, said Muley. They marched in single file across the fields. They came to a water cut and slid easily down to the bottom of it. By God, I bet I know, cried Jode. Is it a cave in the bank? That's right. How'd you know? I dug her, said Jode. Me and my brother Noah dug her. Looking for gold, we says we was, but we was just digging caves like kids always does. The walls of the water cut were above their heads now. Ought to be pretty close, said Jode. Seems to me I remember her pretty close. Muley said, I've covered her with brush. Nobody could find her. The bottom of the gulch leveled off and the footing was sand. Jode settled himself on the clean sand. I ain't gonna sleep in no cave, he said. I'm gonna sleep right here. He rolled his coat and put it under his head. Muley pulled at the covering brush and crawled into his cave. I like it in here, he called. I feel like nobody can come at me. Jim Casey sat down on the sand beside Jode. "Get some sleep," said Jode. "We'll start for Uncle John's at daybreak." "I ain't sleeping," said Casey. "I got too much to puzzle with." He drew up his feet and clasped his legs. He threw back his head and looked at the sharp stars. Jode yawned and brought one hand back under his head. They were silent, and gradually the skittering life of the ground, of holes and burrows of the brush, began again. The gophers moved, and the rabbits crept to green things. The mice scampered over clods, and the winged hunters moved soundlessly overhead.